Oh, that's okay. Should be good now, I think. Um, so anyway, the CDC says no. We have, compared to other workers and other occupations, we have a pretty significant rate of occupational injury, and that's a challenge, right? We don't want anybody that says I want to come do EMS and be hurt on the job. And our minds when you think about the whole scene safety stuff is often in violence, and rightfully so. EMTs are killed every year by violent perpetrators and that sort of thing. But the reality is, gun violence is really rare when it comes to occupational hazards. The rate of people leaving this job because they were injured by a violent perpetrator, comparatively speaking, is not common at all. Maybe it's orthopedic injuries. Certainly, those are common. We know that if you take a snapshot of the EMS industry, and on any given day, about 10% of our cadre is out on a back injury. So that's clearly something that we should be mindful of and thoughtful of as we develop protocols and think about how we do things. And I think we've taken a turn towards that recently in the last 10 years with power stretchers and lift assist devices and things like that. But the reality is that not too many of us are dying from orthopedic injuries. Many of us are leaving the profession, and that's problematic, but that's not what's killing us. And I think you could probably guess, given the nature of this talk and the title of the talk, that it's transportation injuries that are really killing us. It's from an occupational injury and also from an occupational fatality. That's where the real stuff is. And I think it's important that we understand what the numbers really say. And that's why we wanted to take a look at this and say, oh, okay, if that's happening, what's the data point to? How do we look at what's really going on out there and make good decisions about how to change the things that are contributing to occupational injuries and fatalities? Well, it turns out that ambulance crashes are actually relatively rare. In fact, for every 100,000 runs, we crash 12 trucks. So that's pretty good, except for there's just a hell of a lot of ambulance runs in this country. So when you multiply that number, it becomes a fairly large number. Not surprisingly, there are more crashes in the city than there are in the more rural aspects. I think that is less related to driving capabilities and more related to the fact that there's more ambulance runs in the city than there are in the country that are out there. We do know, and this was some of the stuff that surprised us, ambulance crashes are more common in daylight hours, in particular in the afternoon, than they are at night. They are also far more common on dry, straight, good weather conditions, and in sort of optimal circumstances. And when we went into this, we said, oh, it's got to be Vermont and it's snowy and the roads are icy, and that's when the ambulance crash. Turns out not in Vermont and not in the United States. It is a very different profile of things that are going on there. So lots of information about it sort of just being clean weather. Of the ambulances that crash, about 30,000 of them will result, this is in the United States every year, about 30,000 of them will result in a serious injury. That means someone has to be transported away to the hospital, someone has a life-threatening problem that's going on there, and that represents about 10% of all of the crashes in the United States. So, 1 in 10 is going to result in a really bad outcome. Now, you might say, Dan, okay, 30,000, that's not too bad, right? I mean, that's the entire United States. We're doing pretty good. And I think that's true, right? That's probably not too bad. But the problem is that's 90% of our profession's occupational injuries. 90% of the people who leave EMS because of an occupational injury have it occur because of a crash. It also represents 86% of our occupational fatalities, which means almost 9 out of 10 people who die in the line of duty in EMS are dying because of a crash, right? So although it's a relatively small number, it accounts for a disproportionate number of the people who will have to leave our service because of injury or death. And that's why I think we need to take it seriously. And by the way, if you want to make an accounting of this, that's 5 times higher than our other public safety, than other people who have transportation accidents. When you compare us to, the post office or UPS or other things that drive vehicles around, that's 5 times higher. right? It's higher than cops. It's higher than firefighters, right? When it comes to the rate of occupational hazard associated with this sort of stuff, right? So it's also a personal thing for me. On March 17th, I'm coming up on the anniversary of it, um, St. Patrick's Day, and I still can tell you exactly what I felt that day. But we got T-boned going through an intersection with a full arrest. I'm driving the truck. My partner's in the back working a full arrest with a firefighter. A guy hit us going through an intersection. He went through a red light, spun us around on 180 degrees, flipped the ambulance over. And they say that everybody has a personal trigger in their head, you know, PTSD type stuff. And I can't explain it, but mine was, I can remember when the dust settled and I kind of figured out that I was okay and I wasn't hurt. I leaned over my shoulder and I said, "Is everybody okay back there?" And I heard my partner say the word, "No." And that flipped the switch in my brain. I went home that day and I lived in this little studio apartment and I had a braided rug, a circular braided rug. And I got home about 3 o'clock in the afternoon and I sat in the middle of my braided rug and I didn't move until it was dark. I don't know what I was doing. I don't know what I was thinking about. But the one conclusion I came to in that time period, that 6 hour or so time period, was I was done with EMS. I was out, walking out the door, forget about it. Now, my path back was a story of intervention by critical incident stress managers, and it worked successfully. Here I am. But it was the worst day of my life. I wouldn't wish that day on anybody, and it damn near took my career away from me. Damn near. I said, look, I got to go be an architect or a marine biologist or something else. This is not for me. And I wouldn't wish that on anybody, right? And when I think about crashes, I think about that moment because there's a lot more to consider. Yet, look, I get it. We accept a certain degree of risk in our world. I talked about that in my first talk. I think, you know, putting the patch on the sleeve means that you accept a degree of danger of our job, but we're not crashing into each other. We're crashing into other vehicles. We're crashing into other people out there. 84% of ambulance crashes injured at least 3 people, right? And who were they? Yeah, us. We accept the risk, but look at how many were other, right? Look at how many people are injured in those crashes that have nothing to do with EMS, that were going to the grocery store, picking up their kids from school, you name it, right? They didn't accept that risk. They don't own the danger of driving an ambulance, but yet nonetheless, they are involved in those things. In fact, 70% of those serious crashes will result in a fatality of someone. I'm sorry, 70% of fatalities involved in an ambulance crash are people not in the ambulance. That is somebody else, right? So that's a pretty personal thing for me. I got to think about that, right? I mean, isn't our duty to first do no harm? Don't we sort of like understand that? But if our actions are killing people, well, that's not okay. And I think we've got to take some steps. There's also more to it, though, and I wish it ended there. It didn't, right? If you think about those crashes, it's not just about keeping people in the profession. They cost us $500 million annually adjudicating claims associated with ambulance crashes. By the way, this is the copy of the subpoena that I received after the guy ran the red light and crashed into me, right? So consider this. I was 23 years old, and I had to go to my supervisor and say, do I have to hire a lawyer? Now, at 23 years old as a paramedic, I barely had enough money to buy dinner, right? And, you know, how much does a lawyer cost? Well, in 1994, it cost like $68 an hour just to talk to the guy. And I'm sure it's a lot more than that now, right? But that's the conversation I had to have. I don't want any other paramedic to have that conversation. This is about protecting ourselves. So we in Vermont and our medical directors got together and said, what's causing the danger? What is the research? What's the data say about what's causing it? What's making it so dangerous? Why is it there? And of course, it's multifactorial. There's no one thing. But when you do a great big data piece, and I think there's 78 or 85 or something like that, around 100 studies that we looked at from the last couple of decades and said, what does it come down to? Here's what it tells us, that it's lights and sirens, it's driver stress, and a little bit of driver profile. And if you break it down, it's pretty straightforward, that if we can get to those three things, we can make a safer world for all of us. And we'll talk a little bit about each one. So first of all, lights and sirens, and I don't think that's any big surprise. There's been plenty of smart people talking about that one for years. We know that 80% of all crashes in ambulances have the lights and sirens on. We know that 70% of all fatal crashes are lights and sirens related incidents, right? And you might be saying to yourself, Dan, what's the linkage? Why are lights and sirens so dangerous? Well, I'd suggest to you it's this, right? You flip that little switch on, and all of a sudden we're in a little bit of a different mode from a central nervous system standpoint, from an awareness standpoint. We are in that sort of fight or flight response. Now, people will point to On Combat, as a book to read about stress response and situational stress. And I think it's a wonderful book. You should read it. But the landmark text on this was written by a guy named Salas. Driscoll and Salas are the two authors of this book. And it's a terrific read about how the human body performs under stress and how it changes, how human performance is affected in these stressful moments. And, certainly when I flip those lights on, we get a little bit of epinephrine and norepinephrine. And I know there's somebody in this room going, not me, Dan. But that's not what the research would point to. The research would point to the fact that although you may not even realize it, your body's changing in these moments, right? We know that as those driving situations go, when we're going fast and the lights and the disco things are happening around us, right? We're getting a little bit of this stress response. Now, it's not uniformly bad, right? But I think it does set us up for some dangerous conditions, right? Those brain effects are dropping in on us here. For those of you who are human performance geeks, you'll know the Yerkes-Dodson law, the curve, which basically says a little bit of stress isn't bad. We want heightened awareness in these moments. We want our brains to focus a little bit more sharply, and that does happen. But the problem is, for many of us, once we peak that Yerkes-Dodson curve, right, we're now in a place where that stress is not helping us. And in fact, it may be impairing us in these moments, right? It may be doing some things that are really bad. And if you go back to what Driscoll and Salas wrote in their landmark text, it says it changes our cognition, it changes our awareness, it changes our perception. None of those changes are compatible with safely driving an ambulance, right? If you don't have full awareness, if you don't have full field of vision, if you don't have auditory capabilities, if you don't have good decision making, all of those things set you up to a place where a crash is more likely. And by the way, cognition and correlation and causation all accounted for here. We certainly can at least correlate lights and siren conditions with more crashes, right? I don't think you have to be a statistician to point to the fact that there's a likely link here, even though we may not be able to prove it. I also think there's a big cognitive load piece, right? A guy named Sweller back in the 90s talked about cognitive load theory. I'm sure you've all heard that now. But, the notion of cognitive load theory is that working memory can handle about 5 to 7 things at a time. And we know that when we start putting ourselves into stressful situations, that cognitive load theory drops. The cognitive load capability drops even more, right? That we're trying to do too much with our brain. There's also an association among the data that points to when you add elements to the cognitive load, more crashes happen as well. So for example, you are way more likely to crash your ambulance when you are in transport mode. That is, when a patient is loaded into the back, like it was in my crash, and you're going to the hospital. Now, you might say, Dan, why is that, right? Well, we know that there's a little bit of, the driver's got to do more, right? He's got to turn the lights on, right? We know that when we're driving to a call, there's a couple of you. One guy can use the radio. The other guy over here, he's saying clear right and, looking around. But when that patient's loaded in the back, there's one guy back there, right? One person in the ambulance is now driving and shouldering a lot more cognitive responsibility. There's also some of these things. We know that any use of communication devices increases the likelihood of a crash by 50%. So the moment that driver picks up the radio or has to think about anything but driving, he is now at higher risk. But it's not only stress that causes these problems, right? And I think it's not just the lights and the sirens kind of issue. I think there's a certain degree of driver profile that leads us down a dangerous path, right? I would ask the question, are there people that you know that probably shouldn't be driving an emergency vehicle? I hope you're shaking your head yes, because I certainly know quite a few of them. Now, can we quantify that is a reasonable question, right? How do you say to a person you shouldn't be driving a vehicle? Well, look, insurance companies have been quantifying risk for 100 years, actuarial tables and things like that. You know that if you eat a lot of cheeseburgers and you get morbidly obese, you're more likely to die. Well, we can do that. We have similar data that point to the quantifiable risks of driver behavior. So Dan, what are the relevant risk behaviors? What are the things that we should be looking for? I hate to tell you this, it's youth. And with all due respect to the young people in the room, that is certainly a big one. 30% more likely to cause a crash than a person of older age. Now, it doesn't mean that you're independently a bad driver, right? There's plenty of young people that are good drivers. But what we do know is that the risks that the risks of a crash are associated with experience of previous crashes, right? So I was a better driver after I crashed an ambulance because I realized what that happened and it made me more aware. And when you don't have that experience, you're put at sort of an unfair advantage. You're more likely to drive at using risky behaviors like, high G turns and rapid decelerations and all that kind of stuff. And by the way, that's not true just in EMS. That's true across all of the driving literature. We know that young drivers who lack experience have that. Now, there's a couple of pieces to this. One is because those young drivers, are more likely to take those high-risk behaviors. And it's also because of that risk perception that we talked about. Now, you might say, Dan, why is that? Well, because that low anxiety points them in that direction, right? They haven't had the experience yet. But there's also another piece about the developing brain, right? When you think about an older driver, they have a combination of both experience. Maybe they almost got in a near crash. Maybe they had a crash before that tempers their risk-taking behaviors a little bit. Plus, they also have a little bit more developed prefrontal cortex. And that prefrontal cortex takes off that risk-taking behavior edge, right? As you've learned over time as an older person, you can take away. A younger driver lacks the experience, but the combination of that is also a less developed prefrontal cortex. And that doesn't mean they're dumber, right? It just means that lack of developed prefrontal cortex makes them accept risk-taking behavior a little bit more aggressively than a person who's a little bit older than them. Now, here's the thing. It makes it both a biological and a psychological influence, right? So there's the brain development, but there's also a psychological impact on here, right? And when we think about our groups, our culture, do we influence young people into taking risk-taking behaviors? How about this? Watch any television show on TV about public safety, right? And tell me if you're going to see the ambulance going fast, right? I told you I grew up on emergency. How did emergency open up? The garage door opens up, the trucks come out, lights and sirens. We're going through stop signs, going fast, right? We built the culture in EMS around going fast. Going fast is cool, right? Lights and sirens, we accept that it's cool. And by the way, I know I'm giving you people in the back row don't even know what emergency is. I know, I understand. I'm with you. Okay, good. I'm glad you do, right? But there you go. Okay, good. But I would suggest that if you watch Chicago Fire, you watch any of these things, it's going to see the same thing. It's going to show you the same thing. The picture that part of our culture is about driving trucks fast. That's why people want to come and join us. And, okay, I get it. It's cool. I feel the need for speed too. I like that. But the problem is speed kills. And we know that speed is an independent risk factor, right? In fact, it is probably the most important risk factor we have when it comes to looking at the antecedent causes for crashes, right? Don't go fast is the message that we should be teaching our people as much as possible, right? In fact, for every kilometer exceeding the speed limit, we significantly increase the crash risk, right? And there's a lot of things we do that cause risk to crashes that have, so for example, if somebody came to work tomorrow drunk, we would say, what are you, crazy? You can't get behind the wheel. Being intoxicated is a massive risk factor associated with ambulance crashes. Go home. We would send them home and we would have no patience with that at all. But if the kid comes in and says, I can't wait to go fast, we'd go on, girl, you're cool, right? Except that's not how it should be, right? We should have a cultural concern with whether we drive fast or not, right? Because the mixed message that we're saying is it's cool to go fast, but speed kills. And that's incompatible if we really want to make ambulance driving more safe. There's one other category of risk that we should talk about, though, and that's the driver profile. What we know when we look at the actuarial tables of ambulance crashes, it's very commonly associated with people who have a risk of poor driving, right? So when you look back at people who crash ambulances, very likely, in fact, the responsibility of emergency medical vehicle driver had a history of crashes 71% of the time in collisions, right? 41% of operators had poor driving records, so not just previous crashes, but speeding tickets and moving violations and things like that. And crash history was a reasonably good predictor of a 1-month crash risk. So if you crash before, you're likely to have a crash again. Now, look, again, I don't think we should fire every single person that ever crashed a truck or, dinged a, their bumper backing up. That's not what I'm saying. But it is something that we should be mindful of, and I think it's something that we should come into our consciousness when we think about who's driving our vehicles. So if those are the risks, what can we do about it? I would start by saying I think we have to have a very serious conversation about lights and siren use. Right? I think we should have not only a serious conversation, but a truthful conversation, because the conversations that we've had previously about lights and sirens are full of nonsense and full of assumptions that are based on very little fact, based upon very little research that goes into it. So the first question we'll ask is, look, lights and siren, it gets us there sooner, right? Well, that's not exactly necessarily true. In fact, there's a whole lot of research that differentiates the perception from reality. The assumption is, yeah, if I flip on the lights and sirens, I'm going to get to the hospital faster. Well, let's go to Georgia. They went out and they, there's 2 studies that I'll mention here. There's 4 studies that I'll mention here. Basically what they did is they had a researcher with the crew. He had a stopwatch, and they would load a patient into the back of the ambulance, and they would drive to the hospital on a lights and sirens response, and he'd time it. The next day, at the same time of day, they would then take a personal vehicle, drive the same route, again, at the same time of day, and they would time it. So they did that in Georgia. What did they find in Georgia, you ask? They did 50 transports. The average difference was 43.5 seconds. Less than a minute of difference. In Georgia, driving lights and sirens, and this was in South Carolina, I guess it is. Didn't make a difference at all, right? Syracuse, they did this study when I was working in Syracuse, did the same thing, 32 responses, difference was 105 seconds. Not even 2 minutes of difference. Okay, now, the confounding ones are Minnesota. They did both rural and urban. So the rural ones were, represented the outskirts of the cities. They found 67 responses, averaged somewhere between 3 to 4 minutes of different. They could make up 3 to 4 difference of minutes in terms of the response. And then in the urban one, they found it was about 3 minutes. I'm not exactly sure what they did differently. Maybe the driving in Minnesota is just fundamentally different than it is in South Carolina and New York. I don't know, right? But I'm willing to concede that we can probably save 1 to 4 minutes based on that. I don't believe the Minnesota one, but I'm willing to concede it because, who am I to doubt data? I believe their methods were fine. Okay, we could save 1 to 4 minutes. The next assumption that we have to question, though, is, well, that's going to save lives, correct? Well, there's also some research there, too. This is 112 transports in Pennsylvania. And again, they found that there was an average difference. They looked at ones that came in with lights and sirens and ones that didn't. The average was 2.6 minutes, so reflective of our time frame that we were talking about here. There were 5 patients that were in that had got critical hospital interventions. So 5 of those transports came in and said, whoa, this guy needs a chest tube, this guy needs a surgical airway, something of a critical intervention. How many of those interventions happened in the first 2 minutes of arrival? None. None. So even though they arrived at the hospital 2 minutes sooner, it didn't make any difference because that intervention didn't happen in the first 2 minutes. The good people of the ROC, the Resuscitation Outcome Consortium, I love these guys because they're doing all kinds of great research in a million different ways. But the ROC got involved and they said, okay, let's look at trauma patients. 3,600 trauma patients that were analyzed, 800 of those patients died, right? So this isn't just like I stubbed my toe trauma. These are real significant trauma, included real significant trauma patients. What they found was no significant association between time and mortality for any EMS interval activation. There was no difference when it came to how fast they got there and the interventions that occurred. So, okay, I'm still willing to consider that maybe you can make up a little time. And I'm willing to consider that maybe that surgical airway would be beneficial. But if that's the case and we're only talking about 2 minutes, I think we could probably find 2 minutes of scene time to make that up that would take away the need to go lights and sirens. Maybe instead of starting that complex IB and doing it 14 times, maybe instead of, hanging around the house for as long as you did, I think that 2 minutes is a relatively, we could find it somewhere else besides putting our lives at risk. Now, I'm not saying never. I don't want to take lights and sirens off a truck. I think based upon the research that I've seen, I think you could make at least a fleeting case in my head that there could be an occasion where that time does matter. So what I would say, though, is if we're going to do it, that provider who's behind the wheel should be looking at the risks and benefits. And if he or she cannot say there is a very clear benefit of using lights and sirens, we should not be using it. And that's the message that I hope we can get to all of the providers in Vermont, right? I'm not saying don't ever use it. When you do, make sure it counts, which means they got to use their brain here. That the days of just flipping the lights and sirens on every time you get in the back of the truck need to be over. And by the way, we got to have a policy for this, right? Now, if you want a policy, Wisconsin has a wonderful policy. You can download it, you can cross out Wisconsin, you can write in Kentucky, you can write in your agency's name on the top. NFPA has 2 policies that are available for your sample benefit. You can create one, use it for your agency, but the point is have a policy, because when we have a policy, people are 5 times less likely to use lights and sirens. When we simply explain what the dangers are, what the rationales are, people are less likely to engage in that risky behavior. This is low-hanging fruit, people, right? Let's just get a policy and train it. Not only do we train it, we've got to have a couple of key elements, right? Now, I hope by now that you're, staging some kind of a dispatch priority system. I mean, that's 1994 technology where we're saying, hey, perhaps you shouldn't go lights and siren to the guy who stubbed his toe or has a toothache or something like that. I hope I don't have to say that, but I'll say it because we're still doing some crazy stuff out there, right? But okay, we also want to make sure that there's clarity for when those decision-making, when the lights and siren decisions are made, right? The other element of that policy should be public education. Right? We should be talking to our stakeholder groups and saying, we are not going to go to every single call with lights and sirens. We are not going to transport every patient with lights and sirens, right? And I know that's a long-term game, but we're really bad at long-term games. And I think we can talk about this kind of stuff when we go on the TV news and stuff like that. This is what we're doing, ladies and gentlemen. The other thing that I think we need to be thinking about is that sort of organizational and cultural change. If we're not paying attention to when our providers are using lights and the sirens, there's no value whatsoever in having a policy. And by the way, that's when you medical director types come into play, right? Again, think about what we're doing, and we're credentialing people and we're reviewing people. We're looking at their airways, with a fine-tooth comb. Why are we looking at their airways with a fine-tooth comb? Because guys like Henry Wang said, you're killing people. We're killing people, right? What else do you need to hear? So how about at the same time that you're looking at that intubation, at the same time you're reviewing that surgical airway, let's make sure that we're triggering a QI response. I see the U1 lights and sirens, Dan. What was your decision-making process? Oh, okay. Guy needed a surgical airway. You couldn't control it in the back of the truck. Fair enough. I did an OB exam for a woman in labor, and I looked down and a little foot was sticking out. Good for you, Dan. Good choice. I'm happy that you went lights and sirens in that circumstance, right? But I think you'll find as we do this, there'll be ample opportunities when the guy says to you, well, there was a lot of traffic, so I went lights and sirens. Let me help you make that decision better next time. And I'm not saying it has to be like, gotcha, you're fired, or that kind of stuff, but that's what medical directors are for, right? That's what we use them for airway. That's what we use them for lots of other procedures. This is an optimal opportunity for you to say, hey, let me give you a little bit of guidance here, because this is a dangerous situation, right? It's not just up to the medical directors, because they can't be on every call. And it's up to us as well, cultural, right? The theory of planned behavior, which basically means that when that kid goes to push the lights and sirens button, if the person sitting next to him goes, what are you doing there? Maybe he goes, oh, okay, maybe I shouldn't do it, right? We've got to police each other. We've got to make it a cultural thing that says, yeah, okay, lights and sirens are important sometimes, but let's make sure we're sharing that decision. Let's make sure that it's not cool to go lights and siren just to go lights and siren, right? And that's the responsibility of every stakeholder that's out there. Asking that question, why are we going lights and siren here? Just traffic, no big deal, they can wait, right? I think we also have to model stress, anti-stress measures, right? So ways to calm down, and there's lots of good research around, tactical resilience breathing techniques, right? Look, before you get behind the wheel of a truck, take a couple seconds to calm down, right? Especially if you're feeling a little overwhelmed. And just some deep breathing can help us with those sorts of things, right? I also think that as we teach our new candidates, we need to be talking about things that going faster is not typically beneficial. We need to talk about these data that we are presenting. We need to teach them about the ill effects of moving, right? If you're bouncing that patient down the road and they're puking all over the back of the truck, that's not helpful to the patient in most cases, right? Maybe we even give them an opportunity to experience being in the back of the truck and feeling the effects of movement, right? We want to teach them to drive from the patient's perspective unless it really means something to not, right? And we also need to manage that cognitive load as well, right? I was always fascinated. You guys remember what's his name? Captain Sully landed the plane in the Hudson River. When you go back and listen to his news conference afterwards, he said some really interesting things. They said, what were you thinking about, Captain Sully? And he said, I just kept repeating in my head, just fly the plane, just fly the plane, just fly the plane, right? Captain Sully had a million priorities in that moment. He had a cognitive overload that was inconceivable for most of us to ever even think about. But in that moment, when all the alarms are going off, what was he thinking about? I just got to get this plane down. Right? We'll worry about all the rest of the stuff later on. I think we can take that lesson, right? Because what we're asking them to do right now is a cognitively overloaded state. We're asking them to navigate and drive code 3. We're asking them to communicate and drive code 3. We're asking them to give the hospital a report and drive code 3. When what we really should be doing is saying, just drive code 3. Right? If that's your job, if that's the task we're giving you, forget about all the rest. Now, maybe you got to navigate. I get it, right? And I know it's not that simple, right? But what we have to do is work towards making it more simple. And yes, every once in a while, we'll have an exception. But we can't make driving code 3 the routine. We can't make taking those risks something that we routinely accept and say, sure, this is okay with us on a regular basis. It has to be the exception. It has to follow a policy. And it can't be improvised. It has to be prepared for. Because remember, when they flip those lights and sirens on, when they start driving that ambulance, we should think of them like holding a bomb, right? Because that bomb's about to go off. Let's make sure we've given them every single tool to defuse that bomb before the predictable outcome happens. I think the other thing that we should be thinking about is a little bit of training. And I know many of us do training. I hope you do. But in terms of the things that we do every single year, training is rarely among those elements. And again, if you quantify the risks of the tasks that we ask an EMS provider to do, driving is perhaps among the most risky things. So let's get back to a place of training. Now, I think training does some important things, and you may argue the fact of the validity or the value of EVOC or the different training modalities, but I think simply having a training session every single year sets a tone that's really necessary in any agency, and that message is we take it seriously, right? We take driving seriously here. We're going to do training every year. We're going to make sure that we're reviewing it every year, right? It can also help us with screening some drivers that perhaps shouldn't be there. It creates some procedural memory out there, helps with cognitive offloading, lots of things. And I get it. There's no one size fits all thing. Maybe your organization can't do EVOC every year. Maybe you're just going to sit around a room and have a talk like this about the risks or talk about the data or talk about other things. I think that's okay. You can tailor it to your shop and tailor it to the needs of your providers out there. But I think there's a couple things that it should include. One is it really ought to have an opportunity at least some point in that career to have some coaching, right? If you're not confident that your people are driving properly, what are you paying attention to, right? Of all the risky behaviors they're doing, at what point can you just put a supervisor in with them and say, hey, drive me around the corner, or, let's get some feedback on that, on your driving behaviors that are available to us. I think there's lots of different ways to do that, but I think whatever training we're doing ought to include a little bit of that. There's high-tech solutions out there. You can buy the high-end driver trainer simulator kind of things. We buy lots of simulators and spend. I just was at a site visit. They just spent $156,000 on a sim man, right? At a Perkins grant at a local community college. I can get a couple of these for $156,000. Now, again, I'm not trying to take away your sim men. I think sim men are great too. But why do we use sim men? Because we want to prevent errors and dangerous procedures and train. Here's a good opportunity to use some of these things. And by the way, we're not going to use these that often. So this could be a regionalized device. You want to talk about medical direction regions. Here's a great purchase for a medical directions region. Let, different service use it every other night. And by the way, we know that they work. There's a lot of research out there, whether it's simulation or the feedback devices. There's all kinds of feedback devices out. By the way, I have no conflicts here. I'm not trying to sell you anything today, but devices that either mirror, report on driving behaviors like cameras or G-force indicators. Those aren't new. They've been out there for a long time. Those are all available out there on, you can pick them up, and they're relatively expensive, but not too much. And you might say, but Dan, we don't have the money. We're just a small rural Kentucky ambulance service. We're a small Vermont ambulance service. We don't have the money for this kind of stuff. Well, consider this. 20% of crashes result in more than 31 lost work days. And when you're an ambulance service and you have to replace Dan Batsie, who's out for 30 days, you're not replacing him with a normal provider. You're putting him an overtime person. So how much money is that crash just cost you? My guess is it probably just cost you more than whatever feedback device would cost on any given spot moment, right? Employer costs for crashes are astronomical. The average crash cost an ambulance provider $17,000. That means just uncomplicated, didn't kill anybody, didn't do anything. If we hurt somebody, the cost goes up to $74,000. If we kill somebody, well, that's a $500,000 bill, right? And by the way, those numbers are from 2015, right? So I would dare say that it's probably a little bit more costly today, as everything is more costly today compared to 2015, right? So put it in that context. I mean, what's the investment? And by the way, there's so much good research about agencies that did invest and got great return. And let me just share this one with you. This is a big ambulance service, and they put feedback devices in their trucks. They said they looked at like braking and and a couple of things. So again, busy ambulance service. Uh, Here's what they found after they put these devices in. First of all, one of the things they detected was whether people wore their seatbelts. Well, the moment they put this device in, their seatbelt violations dropped from 13,500 in the first month to 4 3 months later. Right? Yeah, pretty good success, I would suggest. Low rates of sustained, I'm sorry. And by the way, that was sustained. They had, by the way, that's a 3,375-fold reduction in seatbelt violations. These are overspeed violations when they were counting it. How fast did people go? Remember we said speed is an independent risk factor associated with crashes. Look at where that speed violations went in 2 months. None. Dropped it almost off the map. This is over force trends. This is high speed turns. So just by the fact that somebody was watching, it changed driving behaviors. Not only changed it, but changed it radically, right? To a point where there was almost none. In the end, this agency reported a 20% cost saving in vehicle maintenance within the first 6 months. Brake pads, crash stuff, that kind of thing. The cost savings completely covered the implementation costs of the total system. And again, this is a big agency that put in multiple devices. So I think there's ample opportunity and ample data out there that shows real success, at least something to think about anyway. All right. The last thing, if we really want to change these behaviors and these strategies, is let's all accept that driving has to be a privilege. That not everybody that walks into your agency should be driving a vehicle, right? We need to have a system to say, yes, you're approved to drive. And consequently also, no, don't get behind the wheel. We need a way to reject those people. And there's a lot of different ways to do that sort of risk evaluation. Typically, it's associated with a set of criteria, and there's a lot of them out there, right? You can find them in a bunch of different ways. What are the key areas of risks? Young drivers, drivers with previous violations, and untrained people. I would suggest to you that at least this group here should never be driving a vehicle. If you can't account for their training, you should never put them behind the wheel, right? I think you're just saying I'm accepting risk when you do that, and that's no good. Now, I'm not saying young people shouldn't drive. And I know the group, they're getting ready to kill me. That's not what I'm saying at all, right? But what I am saying is that we should be screening them, right? Before we turn them loose. We have to acknowledge that this is not a car. And although you can drive your Subaru Impreza into the station, this is a different kind of driving that requires training, that requires orientation, that requires specific on-the-job resources for the specific kind of ambulance that you're driving, right? And we should be evaluating all of those people. This is New Hampshire. They'll be glad. They've already said, you can steal our stuff. You want the criteria? Here it is right here, right? But do something. And by the way, I'm not a lawyer, and you should consult your lawyers and there's lots of different things that you want to consider here beyond what I'm talking about. But the point is, evaluate them. I think before anybody drives, there should be a completion of driver training. There ought to be an observation by a preceptor. It's not, I don't trust you, right? I think you're a nice person. You're a very well-qualified applicant. I'm happy that you're joining our service. Welcome aboard. Meet Joe. He's going to take you for a little ride in the ambulance to see what your driving capabilities are. Maybe you make a little cone course in the parking lot at the elementary school. Maybe just drive around the city. I just want to see what's going on. Maybe part of our rookie school, our orientation, is we're going to observe you on your first 3 or 4 emergency responses. I just want to get somebody's eyes on your capabilities so that if you're not up to par, I can give you the coaching to get you up to par. I can give you the specific training to get you where you need to go. And by the way, we're pulling your driving record. We used to do convictions record once in Vermont. We said when you apply for your license, we need to, we would pull your record and we'd see all the different movies. We ask you to disclose all your violations and stuff like that. And, we weren't ruling out anybody for like speeding tickets or stuff like that. But when we started to look at it every year, and we started that 5 years ago, we said, nope, every cycle, every time you reapply for a license, you now have to submit to another record check. Holy mackerel. You should see this stuff. We have a rule in Vermont EMS, by the way, that says if you are are involved with the police at anything above a speeding violation, you must report it. Do you know how many violations we found that went unreported every single? I bet we found 20 a year since we started doing this among the 2,800 providers, of people who were arrested, people who were jailed, who had DWIs, who had all this stuff that we didn't know about. So I would suggest if you're an agency, you probably ought to be doing this at least every EMS license cycle, if not every year. And I would dare say, given the risk of driving, it's a pretty reasonable consideration to say, we're going to do a driver's check every year. Just see what's going on out there. I think it's money well spent, and would probably, leaning on the data, would probably point out some people that should not be behind that wheel. And again, that should be accompanied by a clear standard so that when you join, when you sign that little packet that says, I'm going to be a part of this agency, that you say, yeah, I'm going to submit to that, right? As a culture, as an organization, as an agency, we say driving is a privilege. And if you do stupid stuff that makes us not want you there anymore, that's going to be a policy violation. I think that makes a lot of sense. And we need to revoke it. All right. Look at that. I'm going to stop right there. My point is simply this. I don't have enough of you, right? When I look around and look at the system in crisis, when I look at recruitment and retention problems, I can't lose any more of you. I can't lose you because you crash an ambulance. I can't lose you because you've gotten sued and decided to leave our world. I can't lose you because your partner got hurt and you've said, I can't come back anymore, right? These are preventable moments, right? If we follow the data, if we follow true facts, we can keep you in our world, and that's what I intend to do. If any of this stuff is helpful to you, shoot me an email. Be glad to share. I hope you'll look at some of the policies that I put out there and take a look at them for your own organizations. Thank you very much for the time here today, and I appreciate it.